Lyra had known from the very beginning that something was wrong. She could feel it in the way the crystal formations hummed differently that morning, a vibration that ran through the ground and up into the mountains where she had built her small shelter. The atmosphere around Vex 7 had changed. Something was coming. After 50 years of living alone on this planet, she had learned to read the subtle signs that most people would never notice. She stood on the wide balcony of her shelter and looked out across the endless plains that stretched toward the horizon. The crystals that covered most of the ground were glowing with their normal pale blue light, but there was something else in the air today. A kind of electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up even through her protective suit. Lyra had removed the suit only a handful of times in her entire life on Vex 7. The atmosphere was not completely toxic to elves the way it was to humans, but it was still harsh and unforgiving. The suit kept her safe. Her 2 dragons were resting in the cavern beneath her shelter. Storm had been sleeping most of the day, his massive body curled up among the warm rocks that sat deep underground, where the planet's natural heat kept everything comfortable. Nova was grooming her scales with her long tongue, a habit that took her several hours each day. The dragons did not seem troubled by the strange feeling in the air, but then again dragons were creatures of instinct and survival. They did not worry about things they could not see. Lyra activated her long-range sensors and scanned the space around Vex 7. The readings came back immediately, and her concerns became very real. There was a ship entering the atmosphere. It was not a small vessel. It was a merchant ship, one of the large cargo haulers that moved between the trading stations in the outer colonies. The ship was moving fast, very fast, much faster than normal approach speed. Behind it, following at a distance but closing steadily, were 3 other ships. These were different. These were military vessels, but not council military. These were pirate ships. Lyra moved quickly, her elf speed allowing her to make decisions and act on them in seconds where a human would need minutes. She contacted the merchant ship first, sending out a standard distress signal protocol that would let them know she had detected them. The response came back almost immediately. The merchant vessel was the cargo ship Artemis, and they were in serious trouble. The pirates had been chasing them for 3 days across 3 different star systems. They had no weapons that could match the pirate vessels. Their shields were failing. Their engines were damaged. They had decided to make an emergency landing on Vex 7, hoping that the pirates would not follow them to a planet that was known to be deadly to humans. That was when Lyra learned that the pirates were not all human. They were a mixed crew, mostly human with some aliens mixed in, but they were coming anyway. They did not believe the old warnings about Vex 7. They did not care that humans were supposed to die here. They wanted the cargo badly enough to take the risk. Lyra made her first call to Storm. She moved down the corridor that led to the dragon caverns. And the sound she made was not words, but something deeper, something that resonated through the stone itself. It was a tone that only dragons could hear clearly, a sound that came from her connection with the creatures she had raised since they were newly hatched. Storm opened his enormous eyes and lifted his head, already alert because he had been expecting this call. He had felt the same disturbance in the atmosphere that Lyra had felt. The dragon stood up slowly, his massive legs extending to their full length, making the cavern seem suddenly too small to contain him. He was over 40 feet long from nose to tail, and his wings were folded tightly against his back. Lyra went to him and placed her hand on his scaled nose, a gesture of affection and communication that they had developed over decades of living together. Through this touch, she shared with him what she had learned: the ships, the danger, the fact that they would need to fly today. Storm understood, or at least he understood enough. The dragon rumbled deep in his chest, a sound of readiness and power. Nova came running from the back of the cavern, her smaller but still massive body moving with incredible speed. She was faster than Storm but less powerful. Where Storm was built for strength, Nova was built for agility and quick decisions. Together, they made a perfect pair. They had never been tested in real combat against anything more dangerous than the crystal storms of Vex 7, but Lyra believed they would perform well if it came to that. The merchant ship Artemis broke through the clouds and began its descent toward the southern plains, away from where Lyra's shelter was located. This was probably a good decision on the part of the ship's captain. They did not know that an elf woman and 2 dragons were on this planet. They were trying to hide. They were trying to find a place to land safely where they could repair their damage and wait out the pirates. The pirate ships came down faster, more aggressive, their descent patterns suggesting they had no interest in patience or negotiation. Lyra could see from the energy readings that they were powering up weapon systems. They were going to attack the Artemis while it was still in the atmosphere, before it could land and before the crew could attempt to escape. This was the moment when Lyra had to make her choice. She could stay in her shelter and let events unfold as they would. The merchant crew was not her responsibility. They were human. They were outsiders. They had broken the unspoken rule by coming to Vex 7 at all. The Space Council would probably not blame her for refusing to help them. In fact, she had probably already broken protocol simply by scanning their ships and learning their names. But something inside her, some part of her that had never completely hardened despite 50 years of isolation, rebelled against that choice. These people were in danger. These people would probably die if she did nothing. She had the power to help them. And refusing to use that power when she had it felt like the worst kind of betrayal of everything she believed. Lyra made her decision in the space of a heartbeat. She looked at Storm and Nova, and without saying anything, she knew they understood. They would fly with her. They had always flown with her. That was what they were for. The three of them moved out of the cavern and toward the wide landing platform that Lyra had built over many years. The platform was made from reinforced crystal, gathered from the deepest parts of the planet and shaped with tools and time and patience. It was large enough for both dragons to launch from simultaneously if they needed to. Storm went first, running across the platform and extending his enormous wings. The wings caught the strange violet air and lifted the massive dragon into the sky. The effort was tremendous, requiring power that seemed impossible from such a heavily muscled creature. But Storm had been flying for decades, and his strength was exactly what he needed. Nova followed a few seconds later, her smaller frame making her launch seem almost effortless by comparison. She spiraled upward, gaining altitude quickly, her ruby-red scales catching the light of the distant sun as she climbed. Lyra stood on the platform and watched them rise. And then she activated the platform's launch system. She had built this system years ago, preparing for a day that she had not truly believed would ever come. Massive crystal formations beneath the platform released stored energy, and Lyra was propelled upward with tremendous force, faster than she could run, fast enough to catch up with her dragons in seconds. She had a harness that connected her to Storm's back, a system of straps and safety mechanisms that allowed her to ride between the dragon's wing structures. It was designed for stability and protection, and it had been her safety net on countless flights through Vex 7's dangerous skies. As Lyra climbed higher, she could see the merchant ship Artemis making its emergency descent toward the southern plains. She could see the three pirate ships changing course to intercept it. She could see the exact moment when the first shots were fired, energy bolts that cut through the atmosphere with terrible grace and accuracy. The Artemis took a hit on one of its stabilizers. Smoke poured from the damaged section. The ship's trajectory became unstable. The captain was fighting to maintain control as the vessel was buffeted by impacts and atmospheric pressure. The pirate ships closed in, preparing to launch a second volley that would probably finish the merchant vessel off completely, and that was when Storm and Nova did what Lyra had trained them for, and what they had always been capable of doing. They moved to intercept. Two massive dragons appeared between the pirate ships and the merchant vessel, moving with a coordination that suggested they had been flying together their entire lives. Which they had. Storm went for the lead pirate ship, moving in from the side and below, attempting to get beneath the ship's weapon systems where they could not target him effectively. Nova moved for the second pirate ship, her speed allowing her to get into position almost instantly. The pirates had never seen dragons before. The records about Vex 7 did not mention dragons at all. The creatures were not supposed to exist on this world. So the shock and confusion of the pirates gave Storm and Nova their first advantage. Storm let out a roar that shook the atmosphere itself. The sound was so powerful and so unexpected that the pirate ship's crew panicked. They had no protocols for dealing with massive fly-in. The crash site was a scene of controlled chaos when Lyra finally touched down on the ground near the merchant vessel. Storm had landed a safe distance away from the ship itself, his massive body settling down with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Nova was still circling overhead, keeping watch for any signs of the pirate ships returning. From above, she could see for hundreds of miles in all directions across the crystal plains. The Artemis was damaged badly, Smoke was still pouring from multiple sections of the hull. One of the engines had completely failed, leaving a trail of scorched metal and crystalline material scattered across the ground. The landing struts had compressed unevenly during the emergency descent, making the entire ship tilt slightly to one side. It was a miracle that the vessel had not simply broken apart on impact. The crew of the Artemis had made their way to the side of the ship and opened an emergency exit hatch. A group of humans began emerging slowly, their movements uncertain and cautious. They were wearing protective suits, though Lyra noticed that these suits were not designed for Vex 7's atmosphere. They would provide some protection, but not as much as they should. If the crew had to survive on this planet for any extended period, those suits would not be sufficient. Lyra climbed down from Storm's back carefully, using the straps and handholds that she had designed into the harness over decades of use. She was unarmed, carrying no weapons, just her suit and her knowledge and her connection to the dragons. As she approached the humans, she could see their reactions shift from fear to confusion to something like wonder. There were 12 humans total. The captain was a tall woman named Victoria, who had gray streaking through her dark hair and the kind of lines around her eyes that came from years of command decisions. She was the first to step forward from the group of crew members, her hand visible and open in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. Victoria's eyes moved from Lyra to Storm to Nova, taking in the impossible sight of an elf woman and 2 massive dragons on a planet that was supposed to be completely uninhabitable for sophisticated life forms. The captain was trained to process information quickly, and Lyra could almost see the moment when Victoria's mind caught up with what her eyes were telling her. The captain said, "You are not what we expected to find here." Lyra responded with the kind of directness that came from spending 50 years without needing to engage in social niceties. She said that the merchant crew needed to get back inside their ship immediately. She said that Vex 7's atmosphere would begin damaging the protective suits if they remained exposed for too long. She said that the pirate ships might return if they decided the potential profit was worth the risk of facing the dragons again. Victoria did not question her. The captain had clearly made a decision to trust this strange elf woman and her dragons. She gestured to her crew and began directing them back toward the emergency hatch. But before she went, she asked one question. She asked who Lyra was and why she had helped them. Lyra considered the question carefully. It was not an easy question to answer. She said finally that she had lived alone on Vex 7 for 50 years, and she had forgotten what it meant to help others. She said that when she saw people in danger, she had remembered. That was all. That was reason enough. Victoria nodded as if this made perfect sense, even though it probably did not. The captain gathered her crew and led them back into the Artemis. Within minutes, the hatch sealed again, and the crew was protected from the harsh atmosphere of the planet. Lyra turned her attention to the ship itself. She scanned it with her personal sensors and found that the damage was worse than she had initially thought. The primary engines were not just damaged, they were destroyed beyond any reasonable hope of repair. The communications systems were offline. The power systems were running on emergency backup, which meant they had maybe 6 hours of full operation before the backup batteries were completely depleted. She accessed the ship's external communication panel through a hatch on the side of the Artemis. Her elf knowledge of technology was extensive, developed through decades of studying and maintaining the complex systems in her own shelter. She was able to interface with the merchant ship's systems and begin a preliminary diagnostic. The news was not good. The Artemis would not be flying anywhere anytime soon. Not without significant repairs. Not without replacement parts that would have to come from off-world. The merchant crew was stranded on Vex 7. Lyra made a decision. She told the captain through the ship's internal communication system that the crew could stay near their vessel for now. She said that she would provide shelter at her settlement, which was located only a few miles to the north. She said that she would bring supplies and help them establish a more secure location where they could wait for rescue. Victoria asked how rescue would come if their communication systems were offline. Lyra told her that she had communication systems at her shelter. She had been on Vex 7 for 50 years, and she had maintained the ability to contact the outside world. It would take time, but help would eventually arrive. The captain asked what Lyra expected in return for this help. This was the question that made Lyra stop and think. She had been living alone for so long that she had almost forgotten that humans operated on the principle of trade and exchange. Everything had a cost. Everything required negotiation. Lyra said that she expected nothing in return. She was simply helping them survive. If and when rescue arrived, the merchant crew could leave. That would be the end of it. Victoria seemed puzzled by this answer, but she accepted it. She said she would have some of her crew begin salvaging what equipment they could from the damaged ship. She said they would prepare to relocate to Lyra's settlement if the weather conditions remained stable enough for travel. Lyra had not mentioned the weather, but Victoria was right to be concerned. Vex 7's weather was one of the most dangerous aspects of the planet. The crystal storms could occur with almost no warning, and when they did, they transformed the entire landscape into a maelstrom of sharp, crystalline fragments moving at speeds that could cut through even reinforced metal. That night, Lyra brought several members of the Artemis crew to her shelter. She had modified one of the cavern chambers to be suitable for human habitation. It had basic furniture, water purification systems, and enough stored food to keep a small group alive for several weeks. The humans looked around at her living space with expressions that mixed gratitude with shock at how sparse and utilitarian everything was. One of the crew members, a young man named David who worked in engineering, asked if Lyra had been completely alone on this planet for 50 years. Lyra told him that she had been mostly alone, except for Storm and Nova and the various animals that lived in the caves and on the plains. She had chosen solitude, and it had chosen her in return. David said that he could not imagine living like that. He said that humans needed companionship and community to survive. Lyra told him that she was elf, not human, and that elves could endure isolation that would break most humans. But she also said that maybe he was right. Maybe she had been lonely even though she had not admitted it to herself. Captain Victoria worked with Lyra to establish a plan for the crew's survival. They would repair what they could of the Artemis. They would establish communication with the Space Council through Lyra's systems. They would wait for rescue in as comfortable a manner as possible given the circumstances. What Victoria did not know, and what Lyra was only beginning to understand herself, was that rescue would not come quickly. The Council would be shocked to learn that Lyra had helped humans on Vex 7. The Council would be outraged that an elf woman had broken the ancient restrictions by providing aid to the very species that had been forbidden from this planet, and when the rescue did come, it would not be a simple matter of picking up the merchant crew and leaving. The discovery that Vex 7 could sustain human life, especially with the help of dragons and an intelligent elf woman who knew how to survive here, would change everything. It would change the political structure of the entire outer colonies. It would change the laws about what humans were capable of surviving. It would change Lyra's life in ways she had not yet begun to comprehend. But for now, in the darkness of the cave with Storm sleeping nearby and Nova keeping watch outside, Lyra told the members of the Artemis crew stories about her 50 years on Vex 7. She told them about the crystal storms and the crystal caves. She told them about the dragons she had raised. She told them about the loneliness and the freedom, and the slow transformation of her heart as she realized that even an elf woman could not sustain her entire existence on the absence of connection. The crew members listened and asked questions, and Lyra found herself speaking more in a single night than she had spoken in entire years of solitude. It was strange and unsettling and somehow healing all at the same time. 3 days passed before the response came from the Space Council. 3 days during which Lyra taught Captain Victoria and her crew how to survive on Vex 7. 3 days during which the humans began to understand that this planet, which had been forbidden to their species for 200 years, was not actually the death trap they had been told it was. The atmosphere was harsh, yes. The crystal formations were sharp and dangerous, yes. The weather was unpredictable and violent, certainly. But humans could survive here, with proper suit maintenance, with shelter, with access to fresh water from the crystal springs that ran through the caves. Humans could not just survive but actually thrive on Vex 7. This discovery was revolutionary, and the Space Council clearly understood the implications immediately. The message that came back was not congratulatory. The Council was angry. The Council was shocked. The Council demanded to know why Lyra had violated the protocols that had been in place since the human species had first attempted to colonize this world. Lyra composed a careful response. She explained that the Artemis had been in genuine distress. She explained that the crew would have died without intervention. She explained that as a conscious being with the power to help, she felt morally obligated to use that power. She explained that the humans had not attempted to violate the planet or its resources. They had simply crashed here by necessity and accident. The Council's response was bureaucratic and cold. They informed Lyra that she would need to remain on Vex 7 and continue to provide assistance to the Artemis crew until an official Council expedition could arrive to assess the situation. They informed her that rescue ships would depart from the nearest space station in 2 weeks. They informed her that there would be a formal investigation into her actions and her motivations. The investigation did not concern Lyra as much as she might have expected. She had made peace with her decision to help. The consequences, whatever they might be, were acceptable. What Lyra did not expect was how quickly things would change after she sent that message to the Council. Within hours of sending her response, another message came through. This one was not from the Council directly. It was from a human trader named Marcus, a man who operated a small independent shipping company that moved goods through the outer colonies. Marcus had apparently intercepted the Council communications, which was technically illegal but not uncommon among traders who wanted to stay ahead of market movements. Marcus was offering Lyra a business proposition. He said that if humans could truly survive on Vex 7, then the planet would become the most valuable real estate in the entire colonial system. He offered to help her establish a trading post. He offered to bring equipment and supplies. He offered to pay her a percentage of all profits generated from trade conducted on Vex 7. Lyra read the message 3 times, trying to understand what Marcus was really asking her. He was asking her to become a businesswoman. He was asking her to help commodify her home, to turn the crystal plains that she loved into a marketplace. He was asking her to monetize her relationship with the dragons and her knowledge of survival on this world. She deleted the message without responding, but Marcus was not deterred by her silence. He appeared in person, arriving in a small trading vessel that touched down on the crystal plains 2 miles from Lyra's settlement. He came alone, which Lyra found strange until she realized that he was trying to make a gesture of peace and good faith. A trader coming alone meant he was not interested in taking anything by force. He was interested in negotiation. Lyra met him on the plains with Storm and Nova as her companions. Marcus was a man in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his entire life traveling between worlds. He looked at the dragons with appreciation rather than fear, which suggested that he had researched his destination thoroughly before arriving. Marcus said that he was not interested in taking anything from Lyra. He said that he was interested in creating opportunity. He said that Vex 7 could become a thriving colony if it was developed properly. He said that with Lyra's help she could become wealthy and influential beyond her current imagination. Lyra asked him what he meant by developing the planet properly. Marcus explained that he meant building cities and mining operations and agricultural centers and trade hubs. He meant turning the crystal plains into farmland. He meant harvesting the crystals for their valuable properties. He meant making Vex 7 a place where thousands of humans could live and work and build futures for their families. Lyra listened to his vision, and she felt something dark and cold move through her chest. She said to Marcus that if what he was describing happened, Vex 7 would cease to be the world she loved. The plains would be destroyed. The caves would be mined out. The balance of nature would be completely disrupted. The dragons would have nowhere to hunt and fly. Marcus said that this was necessary for progress. He said that Lyra seemed to be a reasonable woman, and reasonable women understood that sacrifice was part of development. He said that she could still profit from this change. She did not have to watch the planet transform and get nothing in return. Lyra said to Marcus that she would not help him. She said that she would not cooperate with any development plan that would destroy Vex 7. She said that Captain Victoria and her crew were welcome to stay because they were in genuine distress. But she would not facilitate an invasion of traders and colonists and miners who wanted to turn her world into a profit center. Marcus's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. He said that she did not have the authority to refuse him. He said that the Space Council would make the decisions about Vex 7's development, not her. He said that her opinion, while nice, was not actually relevant to what would happen here. Storm stepped forward at that moment, his enormous head dropping low, his eyes fixing on Marcus with an intensity that communicated very clearly what would happen if the traitor made any hostile moves. Nova circled overhead, her wings casting shadows across the ground. The two dragons had understood Lyra's distress, and they had positioned themselves to protect her. Marcus took a step backward. He raised his hands to show he meant no threat. He said that he would leave. He said that he was disappointed by Lyra's lack of vision. He said that whether she cooperated or not, Vex 7 would change. The secret was out now. Humans could survive here. Traders and business people and colonists would come. She could not stop that. Lyra watched him walk back to his ship. She watched his vessel lift off from the crystal plains and disappear into the atmosphere, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that Marcus was right. By saving the Artemis crew, by sending her message to the Space Council, she had irrevocably changed the future of Vex 7. She could not undo that change. All she could do was try to shape it, to influence what kind of development would occur, to advocate for the preservation of the things she loved about this planet. Lyra made a decision. She would cooperate with the Space Council's investigation. She would meet with the official expeditions when they arrived. She would tell them everything she knew about Vex 7. She would share her knowledge, but she would also fight to protect the core ecosystem of the planet from being completely destroyed. When she returned to her settlement, Captain Victoria was waiting for her. The captain had detected Marcus's ship and had guessed that Lyra was dealing with someone who wanted to exploit the planet's resources. Victoria said that she had experienced similar situations before. She said that once traders and business people knew about profitable opportunities, they descended like predators. Victoria told Lyra that she had a suggestion. She said that if Lyra wanted to protect Vex 7, she needed to position herself as an essential part of any development plan. She needed to become indispensable. She needed to make sure that any colonization or trade activity on Vex 7 had to go through her and had to follow her rules. Lyra said that this sounded like Marcus's offer, with different language wrapped around it. Victoria shook her head. She said that it was different. She said that Marcus wanted to control Lyra and use her, but Victoria was suggesting that Lyra control herself and use her position to protect what mattered to her. The captain's words made sense. Lyra began to understand the complex politics that surrounded her situation. She was not just an elf woman who had saved some humans. She was now a key figure in determining how an entire planet would develop. That gave her power. That gave her leverage. If she played this correctly, she could ensure that Vex 7's development happened in a way that preserved the things she loved about the world. Lyra spent the next week preparing for the arrival of the Space Council expedition. She organized her records and her research about Vex 7. She documented the ecosystem and the dangerous weather patterns. She wrote detailed survival guides for humans who wanted to live on the planet. She created protocols for responsible interaction with the crystal formations and the native wildlife. And she introduced Captain Victoria and her crew to Storm and Nova, teaching them how to interact with the dragons, how to read their moods and intentions, how to understand the bond that Lyra had with the creatures. The lead official from the Space Council was a man named Director Harrison, a human who had spent his entire career managing colonial affairs for the outer regions. He was tall and carried himself with the kind of authority that came from decades of command positions. When he first stepped out of the council shuttle, he looked around at the crystal plains with an expression that was difficult to read. Harrison was accompanied by two scientists, both human, both specialists in environmental adaptation and planetary systems. There was also a security team, though Lyra found their presence more concerning than reassuring. Security teams carried weapons, and weapons on Vex 7 could cause a lot of damage if used incorrectly in an atmosphere as volatile as this one. The director approached Lyra with his hand extended, a gesture of formal greeting. Lyra shook his hand and invited him to her settlement, where they could conduct their initial discussions. Harrison agreed, but he made it clear that he wanted to bring his entire delegation. Lyra told him that she did not have space for over 100 people in her shelter. He could bring a select few, but the majority of his team would need to establish their own temporary camp on the plains. Harrison seemed to accept this limitation, though Lyra could see him calculating space and resources and the logistics of managing such a large expedition in an environment that was actively hostile to humans. The director was clearly beginning to understand just how difficult it would be to operate on Vex 7. Over the course of the next 3 days, Lyra conducted a series of formal interviews with Harrison and his scientific team. She answered their questions about the ecosystem, the weather patterns, the crystal formations, the caves, the water sources, and everything else they wanted to know about the planet. She provided her research data. She showed them her survival protocols. She answered their questions about Storm and Nova, with the patience of someone who had been waiting 50 years for someone to finally ask her these things. The scientists were fascinated by the dragons. They wanted to study them, to run tests, to collect samples for genetic analysis. Lyra refused. She said that Storm and Nova were not laboratory specimens. They were living beings with their own autonomy and dignity. She would not allow them to be treated as research subjects. Director Harrison seemed to respect this boundary. He told his scientists to back off and focus their research on the geological and atmospheric aspects of Vex 7 instead. The scientists were unhappy about this decision, but they complied. On the 4th day, Harrison asked Lyra what she wanted. He said that the Space Council would need to make decisions about Vex 7's future, and he wanted to understand what her expectations were. He asked if she wanted to be paid for her assistance. He asked if she wanted territorial claims or resources. He asked if she wanted political power or representation in colonial government. Lyra told him that she wanted one thing primarily. She wanted Vex 7 to remain recognizable. She wanted the crystal plains to remain largely undeveloped. She wanted the ecosystem to be preserved. She wanted hunting grounds to remain available for the dragons. She wanted the caves to remain accessible and largely unchanged. She said that she would accept humans living on this planet. She would accept limited mining operations and limited settlement. She would accept trade and commerce. But she would not accept wholesale destruction of the environment in the name of profit or progress. Harrison listened carefully to her conditions. He said that this was going to be complicated. He said that many traders and business people were going to want to develop Vex 7 extensively. He said that he personally understood her desire to preserve the planet, but the political pressure to allow development would be intense. Lyra said that she had leverage. She said that without her knowledge and her dragons and her assistance, human survival on Vex 7 would be extremely difficult. She said that any human colony on this planet would benefit from her guidance and cooperation. She said that if the Council wanted to maximize the chances of human success here, they would need to listen to her concerns. Harrison asked if she was threatening to withdraw her cooperation if her conditions were not met. Lyra said that she was simply stating facts about the situation. She was not threatening. She was making clear what the reality would be. The director smiled slightly at this. He said that he respected her directness. He said that he would advocate with the Council for her position. He said that he would work to establish a framework where Vex 7 could be developed in a sustainable and responsible way. But he also warned her that not everyone on the Council would agree. He said that there would be resistance. He said that some people would try to ignore her wishes and develop the planet anyway. He said that she would need to be prepared to defend her position repeatedly over the coming months and years. Lyra accepted this reality. She understood that her life had changed permanently when she sent that first message to the Space Council. There was no going back to her previous 50 years of comfortable isolation. She was now a political figure, a stakeholder in major decisions about colonial development, a voice that needed to be heard and reckoned with. On the 5th day, a diplomatic proposal came through the Council channels. The proposal suggested that Vex 7 be declared a protected planet with limited development rights. The proposal suggested that Lyra be appointed as the official planetary administrator, with authority over all human activities on the surface. The proposal suggested that Storm and Nova be recognized as indigenous creatures worthy of protection under colonial law. The proposal had actually originated with Director Harrison and his team. He had apparently used Lyra's arguments to convince the Council that this approach would be safer and more sustainable than an open colonization policy. Lyra read the proposal 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. She said to Harrison that she would accept these terms, but only if there were explicit rules about what development could and could not happen on Vex 7. Only if there were environmental protections built into law. Only if she had the authority to enforce those protections. Harrison agreed to work with her on developing those specific rules and protections. He said that they would write them together. and he would present them to the Council as necessary conditions for allowing human presence on Vex 7 at all. Captain Victoria found Lyra standing alone on the crystal plains that evening. Looking out toward the distant mountains where her shelter was located, the captain stood beside her in silence for a while. Then she said that Lyra had done it. She had taken a crisis and turned it into an opportunity to protect what she loved. Lyra said that it was not finished yet. She said that there would be challenges ahead. She said that people would try to circumvent the rules. She said that she would need help enforcing protections and managing the planet as it began to change. Victoria said that the Artemis crew would stay. She said that they had decided to become permanent residents of Vex 7. She said that they would help Lyra establish the infrastructure needed to manage a protected planet and limited human settlements. She said that they had realized something important during their time on this world. They had realized that humans were capable of something more than endless expansion and exploitation. Lyra asked if Victoria was speaking for the entire crew or just expressing her own opinion. Victoria said that she had talked to everyone. She said that the crew had voted. 11 out of 12 wanted to stay. Only one member wanted to return to human space. Lyra felt something warm move through her chest. She had been alone so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have people choose to be part of your life. She told Victoria that she was grateful. She said that having the crew support would be invaluable in the coming months and years. The one crew member who chose to leave was David, the young engineer. He said that while he respected Vex 7 and what Lyra was trying to do, he wanted to return to human civilization. He wanted to tell the story of what had happened here. He wanted to help spread the message that humans were more capable of adapting to difficult environments than had been previously believed. On the day that David left with the departing Council expedition, he took a video recording of Lyra with Storm and Nova flying overhead. He said that he would make sure this recording was seen by people throughout the colonial system. He said that he would help make sure that the story of the elf woman and her dragons on Vex 7 became known. Lyra asked him why he wanted to do this. David said that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was tell a true story that challenged what people believed about the world. He said that Lyra's story challenged what people believed about humans, about aliens, about what was possible. After David left, Lyra worked with Director Harrison and Captain Victoria to develop the detailed regulations that would govern human activity on Vex 7. They created rules about where settlements could be established. They created protections for the crystal formations. They created protocols for mining operations, with strict limits on how much could be extracted from any given area. They created wildlife protection zones where the dragons could hunt without human interference. 6 months after the Space Council formally recognized Vex 7 as a protected planet under Lyra's administration, the first permanent human settlement was established. It was small, with only about 50 residents, mostly engineers and scientists and administrative personnel. The settlement was built in a specific location that Lyra had approved, an area that was relatively sheltered from the worst crystal storms and positioned away from the primary dragon hunting grounds. The settlement had been named Vex Station 1, which was a boring name, but bureaucratic names often were. What mattered was not the name, but what the settlement represented. It represented the first intentional human colony on a world that had been forbidden to humans for 2 centuries. It represented the possibility that humans could adapt and survive in environments that had previously been considered impossible. Lyra visited the settlement regularly, sometimes with Captain Victoria, sometimes with members of the crew, sometimes alone. She spent time with the engineers and scientists, answering their questions about the planet and helping them troubleshoot problems that arose from attempting to operate human technology in Vex 7's unique environment. The scientists had a particularly difficult time understanding the crystal formations. The crystals seemed to react to electromagnetic fields in unusual ways. They seemed to generate their own low-level energy signatures. Some of the scientists theorized that the entire crystal lattice that covered much of Vex 7's surface was a massive interconnected system, something like a planetary nervous system. Lyra told them that she believed they were right. She said that the crystals seemed to respond to significant events on the planet. She said that they glowed brighter during storms. She said that they seemed to pulse in patterns that might represent communication of some kind. She said that she had been studying the crystals for 50 years, and she was still learning new things about them. One of the scientists, a woman named Lisa, became particularly interested in this theory. She began conducting research to map the crystal lattice more precisely. She created instruments to measure the energy fluctuations. She collected data for months, and the patterns that emerged from her analysis were remarkable. The crystals did seem to form a connected network. The network did seem to respond to environmental changes, and the responses seemed to follow patterns that suggested something like consciousness or at least organized response systems. Lisa brought her findings to Lyra and asked if it was possible that Vex 7 itself was somehow alive. Lyra said that she had wondered the same thing many times. She said that she was not sure how to define life in a way that would apply to an entire planet. She said that the crystals certainly seemed to respond intelligently to events. She said that perhaps the entire planet was a living system that operated on timescales and in ways that individual beings found difficult to comprehend. This theory caused quite a stir when Lisa presented it to Director Harrison and other council officials who were overseeing the development of Vex 7. Some people dismissed it as wild speculation, but some people took it seriously. If Vex 7 itself was a living system, then development had to be even more carefully considered. It would mean that mining operations and construction activities could potentially harm not just the ecosystem but the planet itself. The theory gave Lyra even more ammunition in her arguments for strict environmental protections. If the council wanted to maintain a functional relationship with Vex 7, they needed to respect the planet's systems and processes. Meanwhile, Captain Victoria had taken on the role of administrator for Vex Station 1. She was overseeing the daily operations of the settlement and working to expand its capabilities. Victoria had arranged for the Artemis to be repaired enough to fly again, and the merchant vessel had been converted into a transport ship that regularly traveled between Vex 7 and the nearest council station. This transport brought supplies and brought new colonists and took away research data and scientific specimens. The crew members who had chosen to stay on Vex 7 had taken on various roles in the settlement. One was working in engineering, maintaining the power systems and water treatment facilities. Another was working in medical services, providing healthcare to the colonists. A third was working in agriculture, establishing a greenhouse where human food crops could be grown despite the harsh climate outside. Lyra found that she enjoyed working with these humans. She found that they asked good questions and took her advice seriously. She found that they respected her knowledge without constantly trying to use it for profit or advantage. The crew of the Artemis had understood something that most other humans had not understood. They had understood that Vex 7 was not a resource to be exploited, but a world to be lived with and learned from. 1 year after Director Harrison's expedition, another significant event occurred. Storm successfully mated with Nova. This was surprising because the two dragons were related through Lyra, but she had always assumed they could interbreed. When Nova became pregnant and eventually laid eggs, Lyra knew that her dreams of expanding the dragon population on Vex 7 were becoming reality. The egg-laying and incubation process took nearly 2 months. Lyra kept the eggs in a specially prepared chamber in her shelter, where she could maintain the precise temperature and humidity that the developing dragons needed. She sat with the eggs for hours at a time, feeling the subtle vibrations that indicated life developing inside the hard shells. When the eggs finally hatched, there were 5 hatchlings. Lyra was overwhelmed with joy and responsibility. She had successfully bred dragons. She could now begin rebuilding a population that had existed on this world long before humans ever arrived. Captain Victoria and the crew came to see the hatchlings, and even these humans who had learned to respect Vex 7 and its systems were astonished by the baby dragons. They were beautiful creatures, tiny compared to their parents but already showing the power and presence that would define them as they grew. Victoria asked Lyra if she planned to expand the settlement now that there would be more dragons. Lyra said that she did not think so. She said that she wanted to maintain the balance she had established. She said that limited human presence on Vex 7 was acceptable as long as the planet's systems remained largely intact and functional. But she did ask Victoria for help raising the hatchlings. She asked if some of the crew members would be willing to participate in the dragons' care and education. She said that she wanted the hatchlings to learn that humans could be trustworthy and that partnership between humans and dragons was possible. Victoria readily agreed. Over the following months, several crew members spent time with the hatchlings, helping Lyra teach them to eat properly and to move with increasing coordination, and to begin basic flight training. The dragons seemed to enjoy the interaction with humans. They did not have the deep bonded relationship with the crew that they had with Lyra, but they seemed to recognize that these humans were not threats and might even be friends. 2 years after the first human settlement was established, Lyra began to see the results of her careful management. Vex 7 was changing, but it was changing in ways that were sustainable. New settlements were being established, but slowly and carefully, in locations that had been approved for development. Mining operations had started, but they were limited in scope and monitored closely to ensure they did not damage the crystal lattice systems. More importantly, humans were learning. David, the engineer who had left the planet to tell the story of what had happened, had successfully spread the message throughout human space. The story of the elf woman and her dragons on Vex 7 had become famous. It had inspired other humans to reconsider what was possible for their species. It had started conversations about adaptation and survival and the possibility of human colonization in environments that had previously been considered impossible. New colonists arriving on Vex 7 were often inspired by this story. They came wanting to be part of something meaningful, wanting to help build a sustainable colony that honored both human needs and planetary preservation. They were not motivated solely by profit. Many of them were motivated by a deeper desire to prove that humans could do more than simply take from new worlds. Lyra found this shift in human consciousness encouraging. It suggested that humans were capable of learning. It suggested that they could choose to operate differently when they understood the necessity and the potential benefits of doing so. But Lyra also maintained her caution. She knew that for every colonist who came with good intentions, there were traders and business people who wanted to exploit Vex 7's resources. She remained firm about the regulations and protections she had established. She refused to approve mining operations that were too large. She refused to allow settlements in sensitive ecological areas. She refused to permit construction projects that would damage the crystal formations. Director Harrison had returned to Vex 7 every few months over the 2 years, checking on the progress of the colony and the status of the planet. He seemed pleased with how things were developing. He said that Lyra's approach had become a model for sustainable colonial development that other worlds were beginning to study and potentially replicate.